Boom! Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's debate on the Iraq War. I, as the affirmative, am going to state that it was justified. So this is an open format, so we ain't got to pass the mic, and we also don't need to debate for 75 minutes, and 45 minutes of it being about a definition. All right. So, yeah, everybody knows who I am, and everybody knows Genuine, or Terrence as I like to call him when we message each other on Facebook. Good old first sausage. Good old first sausage. All right, so I'm gonna start off. I'm gonna lay out.
Oh yeah, I forgot you can hear me. I'm so used to you not being able to hear me. That's why I keep doing thumbs up over and over again.
Yeah, it's open. So, all right. So I'm gonna start off. The anti-war movement in America is one of the most morally repugnant ideologies that I have had the pleasure to go head-to-head with. We are speaking of a place that was known as a concentration above ground and a mass grave underneath. I will argue for the justification of the Iraq War. To further clarify, I will offer the following definitions. Weapons of mass destruction. Weapons with the capacity to inflict death and destruction on such a massive scale and so indiscriminately that its very presence in the hand of hostile force can be considered a grievous threat. Modern weapons of mass destruction are either nuclear, biological, chemical, or I think the Army now has moved it to chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear, CBRN. But so we're going to maintain that. Jus cogens is an international law principle which is accepted by the international community of states as a whole as a norm from which no derogation is permitted, right? So what that means is like, it's not an explicit, it's an implicit rule for the international community. Now, before moving on, I want to clarify the burdens of this round. As the affirmative, I must only prove that the Iraq War was justified. This is also not about the failure of the Department of Defense and State Department's counterinsurgency doctrine. Having said this, my value is utilitarianism, a doctrine that is useful is the good, and that the determining considerations of right conduct should be the usefulness of its consequences, specifically a theory that that the aim of action should be the largest possible balance of pleasure over pain or the greatest happiness of the greatest number. To preview my case, I will list my 4 contentions: weapons of mass destruction, the 4 reasons a sovereign nation loses its nationhood, our fault he stayed in power, and blood for oil. And with that being stated, before I move into my cases, I would like to pass it over to Terrence.
All right. So, and I'm not trying to make any excuses starting out, but I just want the record to show that this is unprompted debate right here. This is one of those where, like, as Joe said, we were talking on Facebook and we just decided, that sounds really weird. We were talking on Facebook at midnight and decided to do a debate. So, but I think this should be a very interesting debate, considering this is the Iraq War was justified, with 2 veterans who are debating it, who are on opposite sides. My defense as the con is going to be, and this is a military term, which is that the juice was not worth the squeeze, meaning that the amount of effort, the amount of lives, and the amount of everything else that we put into this since 2012, let's call it 2012, has not been worth the money, not been worth the lives, not been worth anything, considering that here we are some years later and we are still there. So with that being said, I will pass it back over to Joe.
So before I move into my 4 contentions, I've actually kind of hoped somebody would build a case of pragmatism against my case, because my case is pretty sound for the actual invasion of Iraq. And I'm sure other people have seen my debate on the Iraq War. I've actually done a lot of apologetics for the Iraq War, but nobody's ever really brought up like the fact that it costs so much, therefore it's not sufficiently true to be invaded. So I do want to have that discussion more so than I'll bring up my points later on. So when we talk about like what did we gain from it, really, what did America gain from it, right? So from a consequential standpoint, even from a pragmatist standpoint, well, we gained a foothold in the Middle East, right? Bigger than what we had through Israel and bigger than what we had through Saudi Arabia, right? So these sovereign nations make it very hard for America to be truly influential in in this region, right? Especially with regards to Iran, because Iran is really a big foothold that America needs to deal with. Um, and at the time, we couldn't have dealt with them in a serious manner without having the stepping stone of Iraq. And next, I want to talk about Russia, right? And a legitimate claim on Russia, not necessarily Trump is involved with Russia and things of that nature, right? So Russia is involved with the Middle East, and America, for the most part, was kind of involved with the Middle East, but more so in a pragmatic manner. We were kind of like, well, we can run psyops and we can run some clandestine operations, but we don't need an actual actual boots on the ground. But what Iraq led us to was having actual boots on the ground and having the ability to maneuver against Russia from Iraq, and also the secondary option of Bagram Air Force Base and Kandahar Air Force Base, right there on the southern border to Russia. Thereby kind of boxing Russia in if they had made a move towards before Trump towards Ukraine or kind of balancing out what happened in Georgia. And so that would be one of the many consequentialist afterthoughts for why we invaded Iraq, despite the overwhelming evidence for why we should have invaded. But yeah, there you
go. Okay, so in your first point, when you brought up and I apologize, and I appreciate you being kind of long-winded because it allows me to actually do some research while you're looking stuff up. But my first point to go against that is you bring up that Iraq provided a foothold in the Middle East, allowing for us to be able to mobilize against, say, Iran or against Russia. However, I will remind you that before 9/11, and I guess I just have to reference 9/11 as a starting point, even though I said 2012. Before that point right there, the United States already had bases in Kuwait that we were doing deployments out of, well, we were deploying to, and we also had bases in Turkey. So we had Turkey, we had Kuwait, and we had been in Kuwait since, and I had to look this up, Desert Storm, Desert Shield started in August 2nd, 1990. So we already had a foothold in the Middle East, just one state below in Kuwait, and we had been there since 1990. Not to mention the fact that right now, that is still before 9/11. That was a deployment rotation that the United States military was doing, and now since they say the Iraq war is over, that is returned to a base where the garrison goes to deploy. The same as now how they do with deployments in Germany. So I really think that that's a false reason to say that Iraq was important or Iraq helped us out now on the back end of that, because we had Kuwait before that, we had Turkey before that, and both of those are just as strategic in doing wars to Iran and to Russia. And not to mention the fact that we had Germany, so that's even closer to Russia. And I'll pass it back.
So when I talked about Russia, I also brought up Georgia. And if you look at the map, it's right there beside Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, right? And then you've got Iran and Iraq below that. So, yeah, Turkey and Kuwait have bases there, but those bases were more land mobilization forces, and the airstrips there were fine and dandy, but it wasn't enough to really move a great bit. And then you also have stronger holds through Iraq into the Persian Gulf, right? So Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Oman, right down there, and the Gulf of Oman, the Persian Gulf, and things of that nature with Kuwait, right? So all of that led to why we kind of did the afterthought of Iraq and Afghanistan, like I said. So, but like I said, my actual case for United States invading is less to do with the afterthought. Now, I also want to make a statement that most of my uh, statements are based on one, the Desert Storm, right, and two, they're based on the morality of it, and but I do want to specifically talk about what came after, and especially like we created the vacuum, right? The Syria, the ISIL vacuum, and stuff like that. I don't necessarily think that we created it, and I actually have a good amount of evidence to support that ISIL and ISIS was there before we invaded Iraq. They just kind of amalgamated different groups to come into one. But that being said, I'm actually going to get into my first contention. That way we can move on. So, one of the fundamental reasons for invading Iraq was weapons of mass destruction. Now, let me be clear, whether Iraq actually had weapons of mass destruction at this time is irrelevant to the actual issue. The reasoning behind this is that for you to agree that at the time that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction, you were taking the word of a criminal fascistic dictator where he openly blocked United Nations weapon inspectors at this time. The main concern was that Iraq had latent programs, which is why we did not face weapons of mass destruction during the invasion. Now, let us also look at Saddam's open purchase of medium-range Rodong missiles from North Korea as it was rebuilding its banned missile program, as expressed by Mr. K, CIA advisor to Department of Defense. It's from David Sanger. Also from this individual, we see that Bashar al-Assad became a major arms trading bazaar for Hussein government. Next, we have to look at Saddam's actions in gassing 80,000 Kurds as per the Federation of American Scientists. Saddam Hussein's forces reportedly killed hundreds of Iraqi Kurds with chemical agents in the Kurdish town of Halabia in March 1988. The poison gas attack on Halabia was the largest scale weapons attack against the civilian population in modern times. Halabia had a population of over 80,000 of people who were predominantly Kurdish and sympathized with Iran during the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s. After understanding that this individual has used weapons of mass destruction on civilian populations and was trying to obtain more, this alone is justification enough for removing such a repugnant person from power. Yeah.
Was that it? Okay. So, in keeping with that, and I understand how you just tried to cancel half my argument right there, saying that it's irrelevant whether or not they actually had one. But I will say this, as I was looking this up, so we go back to just before this happened. And at this time, Saddam had stopped participating with the UN people that were coming to inspect the silo, to say the people that's supposed to keep a lid on, and the inspectors, I'll say that. The thing is this, it is whether we actually found them there or not, and I'm trying to stay along with what you just said, the fact of the matter is that there was no confirmed sightings of weapons of mass destruction. So for George W. to go and say, and go to Congress and say, hey, this country, I believe. Now, honesty would be him going to Congress or him going on TV saying, I think they might have weapons of mass destruction. Instead, he said, yes, they have weapons of mass destruction. My problem with that is that it was unconfirmed. So it was based off of a lie. So it can't be justified if it's based off of a lie. and that's my defense of that. It's whether they were there or not. I'll side with you and say that that's irrelevant. But the fact of the matter is, he gave word to the public and to Congress saying that there are weapons of mass destruction there when there was actually no confirmation. When I Googled it just now, it was all kind of randomness about George W. Bush lied and stuff like that. And that is a very important thing, that there was actually no confirmed sightings of weapons of mass destruction. And that's my point. And I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, so with that, I will actually take on that we don't even have to take it as an irrelevancy, right? Just a quick point out what Bush told the UN is that the inspection showed that stockpiles of VX, mustard, and other chemical agents were likely hidden in Iraq, and that the regime was rebuilding and expanding chemical weapon production facilities. Right. There was a 2004 CIA report that said that there were no weapons of mass destruction stockpiles, and that's what really gets to the point about Bush misleading the country into an unnecessary war. But I had friends, very close friends, that were in the initial push, and they were also there for OIF 4, so initial push, OIF 4, OIF 7, right? 3 back-to-back deployments. And one of them just so happened to be a part of a team that focused on U.S. suffered. And now this is from C.J. Shivers. But I do have friends that were, I can't really explain any more than that. You obviously understand. But what they found was 5,000 chemical warheads, shells, or aviation bombs were scattered in the Iraqi soil. They did soil samples, and they found that less than a month before Iraq was invaded, they had tried to bury them. Now, when they tried to bury them, they had set up a way for them to possibly go off. And that goes back to what I said about Bashar al-Assad being a weapons bazaar for him, and also the Rodong missiles that he was getting from North Korea, right? So it wasn't like they didn't. It was just at the time they were not capable of using them because they were building them. And I've given you, and I've let you know that they had bought the medium range missiles. They'd had the 5,000 heads. America had actually, prior to invading, had blockaded, and that's where they found the medium range Rodong missiles, because we had blockaded just in time when they showed up. Based on the same CIA information that was later refuted in the 2004 report, where they completely denied finding the Rodong missiles that were in transit to them through Bashar al-Assad. So as much as the civilian population and as the media has stated, there was justification for what George Bush said. Now, I will state that George Bush is not the best talker, and everybody can agree with that. He's a gaffe machine. But he wasn't wrong. He's just very bad at explaining things.
Was that's a stop right there? Okay. What I want to say is, as I'm trying to flip through all of this, and can you, at the beginning of what you were saying, you said that, what was the report that you said that George Bush said it was very likely that, can you repeat that one more time? That first part, it was like right at the beginning, and the word you used was likely. If that George W. Bush said it was very likely that.
Oh yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
So the root of the debate is where George Bush told the UN Council, right, that, I'm sorry, my computer's going crazy. So George Bush told the UN Council that inspections showed stockpiles of VX, mustard, and other chemical agents were likely hidden in Iraq, and that the regime was rebuilding and expanding chemical weapons production facilities, right?
Okay. Okay, so what I want to say is, so when you say that, and it's certain words I wanted to key in on, and one of the words I wanted to key in on is likely. And what I did, uh, basically, that George W. Bush said it was likely that they had this stuff, likely that this was going to happen. Uh, a synonym for likely, possible. Another synonym for likely is imaginable. Now, that word, those words. Now, when you say it is very likely that they have something. Okay. Now, if you say right in the middle is say neutral, and then you go here and say that it's possible, and over here I'm sorry, likely, and over here is unlikely. It comes off the middle right there, off the middle, which is neutral. Now, if there would have been any use of any other word, like if somebody said that, if you would have said that it's imaginable that they might have weapons of mass destruction, then everybody would have been like, oh man, that means nothing. But it seems that he wanted to push for this war, so he used his words very carefully to make everybody think that they must. Now, what I'm trying to look up right now, and I might have to pass it back to you so I can look this up, is what exactly is the proof that the president needs in order for Congress to declare war? Because I do know that it does take just cause, and going to Congress saying that somebody might possibly have something or they might possibly be able to do something is not just cause for declaring war on another sovereign nation. Because if that was true, then the U.S. would have just declared war on Syria for almost the exact same thing, which we haven't. So I'll go ahead and pass that back to you.
Right. Well, I will say that America's skittish attempts at promoting peace in Syria are absolutely wrong, and we should invade. And I would build a very similar case to that. But now I'll move into my second contention. So none of my contentions are really stand out by themselves as whole arguments. They're all four built into what would be the ultimate end for justifying. So the next one I want to talk about is I want to elaborate that Iraq had no justification for being a sovereign state and was no more than a ward of the international community. To state that invading a country is an act of war would be true unless that nation was not a state at all. And that it is not an act of aggression, considering that it is a ward of the international community needing humanitarian intervention. This is an implicit international law, but it falls under a just Kogan's norm. To explain why Iraq has stopped being a sovereign nation, I will give Christopher Hitchens four proposed conditions. I do want to state that these proposed conditions are not made up by Christopher Hitchens. They are part of his argumentation. But there is justification behind what he states outside of it just being Christopher Hitchens. One, if it participates in regular aggressions against neighboring states or occupations of their territory. Two, if it violates the letter and spirit of the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and in other words, fools around promiscuously with illegal acquisition of weapons of mass destruction. Three, if it should violate the Genocide Convention, the signatories to which are obliged without further notice to act either to prevent or punish genocide. And four, if it plays host to international gangsters, nihilists, terrorists, and jihadists. The first point is really easily provable with the annexation of Kuwait, open commitment to war with Saudi Arabia, and the war with Iran. Point two, as per the World Nuclear Association, in 1990, Iraq was clearly in violation of its Non-Proliferation Treaty and safeguard obligations, and the IAEA Board of Governors ruled to the effect the UN Security Council then ordered the IAEA to remove, destroy, or render harmless Iraq's nuclear weapons capability. This was done by mid-1998, but Iraq then ceased all cooperation with the UN, so the IAEA withdrew from this work. That's from the World Nuclear Association. Point three, violating the Genocide Convention. There were multiple instances of genocide from the fascistic crime family, but here is a report from the Human Rights Watch. Human rights workers are the only beginning to sift through the mounds of documents, videotape, and material evidence captured from Iraqi security agencies. Forensic experts are examining several mass graves that may finally provide answers to the fate of tens of thousands of Kurds. Sources estimate the number of 182,000 of Kurds who disappeared during the late 1980s in the so-called Anfal operation, Saddam's campaign to depopulate the Kurdish countryside. That's from the Human Rights Watch. Lastly, the fourth point, yes, Saddam did have terrorist ties. Two well-known cases are Abdul Rahman Yassin, a member of the team that bombed the World Trade Center in 1993, and Abu Musad al-Zarqawi, leader of the monotheism and jihad, a quintessential bin Laden clone who operated in central Iraq. That is my second contention.
Okay. All right. So at the beginning of this last time, you said that Iraq shouldn't have been a sovereign nation because it was basically a burden on the international community. That is extremely irrelevant. It's irrelevant whether or not they should or should not have been. The fact of the matter is, at the time, they were a sovereign nation. Now, I was trying to look up something else, and I'm not trying to give you points to debate my points, of course, but okay, so first of all, according to international law, it is illegal for one country to invade another sovereign nation. Now, the thing about it is, you have to get permission from Congress, and you have to get permission from the UN in order to. The UN has to buy off on the invasion of a sovereign nation. Now, the thing about this is that this was done on the tail end of 9/11. All of this was wrapped up into the same thing. It was wrapped up into, okay, there's Al Qaeda here, and there's Al Qaeda in Iraq also. On top of weapons of mass destruction, there's Al Qaeda there. I think Saddam is working with Al Qaeda. I think all of this right here. So it was George W. used a very, very tragic experience in order to justify, and in order to pull on the heartstrings of the international community in order to justify the invasion of Iraq. Because, as I said, at the time of the invasion, there was actually no eyes on that they had the capabilities, the nuclear capabilities, in which on the wolf tickets that the American people were being sold. So, like I said, once again, that everything was untrue. The whole justification behind it was untrue. So if the justification behind it is untrue, then it couldn't have been a justified war. Like I said, it was everything that was done was based off false pretenses, that there's Al Qaeda there, that there's weapons of mass destruction there, even though nobody's seen them. And so it makes it. I'm just checking the time right quick. I don't want to run out of time. Where's the timer?
It's at 16:50.
Okay, but okay. So I just want to just keep hitting on the fact that it's the justification that was given, the buy off from the UN on invading a sovereign nation, because other than that it would be illegal according to international law. All of it was based off of false pretenses. And with that, I'll pass it back to you.
For everyone watching the debate, it's not under false pretenses. I've given you every piece of evidence you could possibly ask for. I've given you multiple statements that there were actual weapons of mass destruction, that they were implementing improvements to their chemical weapons facilities, that they were trying to build more, and that there is numerous cases of soldiers there who've seen the weapons, and they've soil dated these weapons, and they have found out that they were within the time frame that George Bush had given. George Bush has been vindicated on this, and most news organizations, even liberal biased news organizations, have justified him in that. Now, and you said that there was no that it's irrelevant to the point. Actually, it's very relevant. So if a country is not a sovereign nation based off of the Just Kogans, the implicit international law that I told you, that is one of the main justifications for UN signing off on it. That's for the UN Security Council signing off on it. It wasn't just the United States that invaded. It was a coalition of nations. The U.S. had set up multiple resolutions, right? So the passage of Resolution 1441 and on 18 November 2002, weapons inspectors of the United Nations monitoring verification and special commission returned to Iraq for the first time since being withdrawn. They remained in the country until they withdrew after being notified of the imminent invasion. And even when they were there, they were blocked. So we have to agree that there was a problem.
Okay, yes, and I had to look it up. And Iraq was considered a sovereign nation since 8 June 2004. So, like I said, so whether the guy you quoted considered it to not be a sovereign nation or not, according to the UN, and this is United Nations Security Council Resolution 1546, which was in 8 June 2004, Iraq was a sovereign nation. So that's a completely different debate if you want to say they shouldn't have been one. The fact is that they were one, however. And like I said, I'll just say that right there, and I'll let you, if you want to go to your, what was it, contention 3 and 4? I think you had 4 total.
Then, before we get off on it, okay. One of the points that rarely gets brought up into this debate, but which I find very important position, is that America had a chance in 1991 to remove this evil man and failed to do so, leaving Iraq under his pornographic and terrible rule for 12 more years. We had a moral obligation to the people of Iraq to invade and remove this evil from them. The fact is that immediately after the first Persian Gulf War, Saddam and his forces committed full-scale genocide with number estimates ranging from 20,000 to 100,000 for Kurds and 60 to 100,000 for the Shiites, again from the Human Rights Watch. That doesn't even play into the point that people living under the terrible rule of this tyrant, who openly used torture tactics on his own people. The West imposed terrible sanctions which correlated with the deaths of approximately 1.5 million Iraqis, while Saddam built 12 more palaces for him and his crime family. Now, if you don't think that that's not a moral imperative, that's fine, but I find critic arguments to be extremely well. All right, so the last contention to be made is typically used as a negative colloquialism for the war in Iraq, blood for oil. The only difference here is that the liberation of Iraq gave the oil fields, which were previously owned by the murderous criminal, to the people of Iraq. These oil fields were an integral part of the Iraq economy, and after the sanctions, something was needed to kickstart a dead economy. To the point of how much better the oil production has gotten since the removal of Saddam would be an understatement. As the Wall Street Journal points out, Iraqi oil fields pump 3.6 million barrels of crude a day on average in February, 50% more than 4 years ago. That beat, if only for a month, the country's annual output record of 3.5 million barrels a day in 1979 during Iraq's petroleum heyday. There's also the distribution of the money earned before ISIS took over the fields that kept taxes low. Now, I do want to make it clear that, again, what the arguments I'm building, not one contention is enough to justify the Iraq war. Each contention builds upon itself. We have the moral contention, the critic argument. We have the weapons of mass destruction, and we have the just Kogans, and we have the liberation of the people and making their lives better up until ISIS, which was a failure of the State Department and was a failure of the Department of Defense, which I can't justify that because they did a terrible job. But what I can say is that the initial invasion of Iraq, moving into building a better nation, was justified by the 4 contentions that I've given you.
Okay, well, what I want to say to that is, first of all, you brought up a coalition of nations invaded Iraq. Now, you know this as well as I do, and maybe some just straight civilians probably don't know this. But whenever someone uses the whole little, there's a coalition of nations. Let's not kid ourselves and make it seem like it is evenly split. I remember my last Iraq deployment. I can't remember when I was in Kuwait training up. there was a slide that came up that showed uh, how many international forces were in Iraq at the same time where we deployed. So I'll just say this. At the time I was there, Germany had 12 soldiers total that was there, which is not even a percentage of the amount of American forces that was there. Uh, Not to mention the fact that at this time, the major threat that the U.S. was facing was Al Qaeda, and we were already dedicated and already had committed so many forces to the war in Afghanistan. This war had not been finished, was not calming down, was not cooling down. Yet we decided to start a second war, and I do say we decided to start a second war. We decided to start a second war in another country. Well, when the first one hadn't finished. Now, when you talk about morals, and we had a moral obligation to go take Saddam out, okay, that is something completely different. That is not a justifiable, according to every kind of justification that the president needs or Congress needs to declare war. None of them are a moral obligation. If the United States is going to declare war on everybody that's because of morals, then we would always be wrong, because there's that American arrogance that America is the best nation, America is this, America is that. So we have by moral obligation, just looking at the globe right now. So if we declared war off moral obligation, we'd have already went and got Assad. We would have already went in and got Kim Jong-un. We would have already went into Russia and took out Putin after he invaded Georgia. And that's only some. We all see what happens if you go back to Black Hawk Down, and that what happens when we go to war based off moral obligation. And that was an awesome. I actually love that movie. That's one of my favorite movies. But you also see what happens when that. So the greatest resource, and I know you've heard this before, the greatest resource that the American army, that the military has, is its soldiers. Now, if the greatest resource that we have, which is greater than oil or any kind of oil deposits or anything like that, why are you going to put American lives on the line just because we don't like the way that he's ruling? We feel that it's being unfair. That goes back to the same argument that the United States is the world police, which is what we're going against. We can't go to war based off morals. Coalition of Nations, world's police, finish one war before starting another war, and more reasons equal arrogance. And another reason, and I don't know, I think you might have said that I'm not able to use this, but I'll try to say it anyway, is that there was no plan. Now, whenever you go to war, you have to have an outcome. You don't declare war on another nation unless there's an outcome that you want to reach. That you have to believe that you're going to leave. You have to have a plan to leave the country better than the way you found it. Now, that's part of the reason I'm going to war, because I'm going to take this guy out and I'm going to do this right there. However, when you look at this, and I'm trying to be ignorant of the fact that I'm in the army and I know how it turned out, and just say that when the invasion happened, there was no plan to do it. And whoever you want to give that blame to, regardless, that you don't go into a war unless you have an outcome that you already want to go for. However, there was no outcome. This was rushed because, once again, I'll go back to the fact that this was done, and it was done off the heartstrings of what happened with 9/11, and I'll leave it at that right there.
Okay, I'm going to give a brief summation of what you said. So I really don't like the statement that it's off the heartstrings of 9/11. To some extent, it was an emotional appeal, but you can't make an argument without the triangle of rhetoric, right? You got to have logos, pathos, and ethos, right? So pathos is a part of that emotional appeal. No argument will ever win without some pathos. That's just a simple statement, right? But so you said that there was a failure later on, and we should have addressed that in the initial. Well, the initial plan would have worked. The problem was when we changed presidents and when we moved from a happy-go-lucky country willing to fight for what's right into a country that was damning its own forces, something similar to Vietnam, of course you're going to have problems. And that's why the moral argument is the strong argument here, because the moral argument allows for that to maintain power over time. But we had lost that moral argument because people weren't making it, because people were trying to make these consequentialist arguments and stuff like that. That's why I melded it into my argument platform. With that being said, you talked about the coalition of nations. Yeah, the initial invasion was a bit different on numbers game, and sure, America tends to be the biggest promoter of these, and that's fine. And we are justified in that because we are a superpower. We are the biggest nation. We do have the biggest military, not by numbers, but by strength. So, yeah. And then you say that we should justify this through other countries. Well, not necessarily. They still have to meet just war theory. They still have to meet just cause, comparative justice, competent authority, right intention, probability of success, last resort, proportionality, all of which I explained within my arguments that were correct for the Iraq invasion. I would actually like to see us invade Burma. I think we did a terrible job in the Congo. I think we've done a terrible job in Somalia. We should have done more in Somalia, not less. And I do not like that movie. I will say I do not like that movie. I had Colonel Steele as one of my brigade commanders. He was an outgoing brigade commander. It's Captain Steele for those who don't know, who haven't seen the movie. He absolutely despised it and said it was a dramatization of shit that wasn't true. That being said, I'm going to go into my conclusion. So, in my conclusion, let us review the four contentions as to why Iraq war was justified. Weapons of mass destruction, the four reasons a sovereign nation loses its nationhood, our fault he stayed in power, and blood for oil. I want to leave you with a moral question. Is it not immoral to allow the massacre and subjugation of an entire country under a dictator? Do we not, as the world's leading superpower, have a moral obligation to help those less fortunate than us? I, as the affirmative, say that you do, and I ask you, as those who are judging and watching, to ask yourself in the bottom of your heart, do you truly believe that we shouldn't, that we should let millions of people die so your life can be more convenient? I disagree. And that's why you should affirm the proposition.
Man, that was really awesome. That was beautiful. You almost brought me to tears. Okay, so this is what I'll say. And I do understand that you're trying to pull on the emotional heartstrings going with the moral victory. However, I will go back to my little catchphrase that I love always saying, which is going off facts, not feelings. Okay, so going off facts, not feelings, we look at, you brought up that the war would have won but it had to do with the presidential change. I will look at and say in 2007 was the beginning of the surge, which was a point where we had already begun the war. That was 2007. Obama wasn't elected, did not take office till 2008. So the fact that saying that we were already going to win is not the case. And like I said, the U.S. cannot commit its lives and its soldiers' lives to go deploy off moral victories, because if that's the case, we are never going to be out of war. We are never going to be finished, because there's always going to be some leader that's in another country that do not live up to our Western values. And basically that would be any Middle Eastern country right there, because we'd say Sharia law. So we can't go off morals, because not every country shares our morals, and we can't expect every country to share our morals. What we have to look at is, okay, is this going to be something that's going to at one day affect us? Is this something that's going to be able to work itself out? Now, I can't answer that question, but just like you can't answer that question either, because before it could be worked out, we decided to declare war and go to war in Iraq while we were still trying to and are still at war in Afghanistan. So going to war with another country while we haven't finished the first war is totally just a horrible thing to do. And with the last 16 seconds, I will say that there was still no proof. Then the UN inspectors have been kicked out. So there was no real proof of the weapons of mass destruction, not to mention the fact that we went there as a mass destruction. So please vote